Good morning, everyone. My name's Nicole Freeman. I'm the manager of the Recovery and Return to Work Claims teams here at EML. On behalf of EML, I'd really like to welcome you to this morning's event where we're going to be talking about Victoria's new psychological health regulations, which came into effect yesterday. Cameras and microphones will be switched off for this session, and we also welcome any questions into the Q&A option. Before we get underway, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the land from which I join you today. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which you are joining this meeting, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. This is the second webinar we've run covering the new psychological health regulations due to demand from our first webinar, which attracted 1,000 registrations with nearly 600 people online on the day. We've got more than 750 registered to join us this morning, showing continued strong interest in this really important topic. For those of you who aren't customers of EML, we are Australia's largest manager of personal injury claims, helping people get their lives back after injury or illness for more than 110 years. What makes us different is that we're a mutual. This means we invest in initiatives that help make workplaces safer and return people back to work sooner. Over the past 10 years, through our mutual benefits program, we've invested more than $144 million into research, resources, and services to support the communities that we operate. Earlier this year, EML launched our mental health white paper, partnering with Monash University to showcase new research that uncovered the status of mental health in Australian workplaces today, and it is sobering reading. The research shows that nearly 1 in 3 Australian workers, so over 4 million people, have reported having a mental health condition lasting at least 6 months. Data clearly show that certain industries, occupations, and worker cohorts were more at risk of mental injury. So I really encourage you to take a look at the white paper to gain insights to help you manage risk in line with the industry that you operate in and the work that your people undertake. And we'll share a link to that in the follow-up communications following this session. The data is really a call to action for employers to ensure a mentally safe workplace and protect against mental injury claims. The financial and personal cost of mental health injuries is huge for individuals, workplaces, organisations, and the community. We often hear employers ask, how can they distinguish between mental health issues stemming from personal circumstances and those driven by work? As with physical injuries, we need to take a holistic view when it comes to mental health. Whether or not a mental injury is compensable under workers' compensation, it still affects the workplace through absenteeism, lost productivity, and the overall well-being of teams. That's why it's so important for employers to take a comprehensive view of employee health and well-being. The purpose of the new regulations is to ensure that all of us as employers provide a psychologically safe workplace for our employees. It can seem overwhelming, but there are clear actions that an employer can take, and the aim of this session is to support you to do just this. I'm pleased to have 2 expert speakers, Dhawal Patel and Arthur Papagiannis, to share their knowledge with us today. They're each going to speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have time for your questions. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Dhawal Patel. Dhawal is the founder and director of RAS-OHS, a consultancy based in Victoria. He's also a former WorkSafe Victoria inspector with over 20 years experience in high-risk industries. A master mariner, he's held leadership roles globally, ensuring compliance with health, safety, and environmental regulations. Dhawal brings practical compliance expertise and frontline operational insight to workplace health and safety. He's going to give us an overview of the new regulations and outline key expectations for employers, drawing on his experience as a former WorkSafe psychosocial safety inspector to discuss some of the potential enforcement approaches. Our second expert speaker this morning is Arthur Papagiannis. Arthur is a registered psychologist and CEO of AP Psychology and Consulting Services, and he advises executives on preventing psychosocial harm and meeting WHS obligations. With more than 25 years' experience, Arthur is a leader in psychological health and safety. A trusted executive coach and speaker, Arthur helps shape safer, mentally healthy workplace cultures across Australia and New Zealand. He's going to be talking to us this morning about a WorkSafe funded program called Mentally Healthy Workplaces, which will support 300 Victorian businesses over the next year. He's going to explain how psychosocial risk assessments can lead to targeted action plans, and he'll also share some case studies to highlight how businesses have strengthened controls and improved compliance with state regulations. A warm welcome to both Dhawal and Arthur, and I'll hand over to you now, Dhawal. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Nicole. Again, it's great to see the numbers just going up, 340 I can see now. Again, glad to be here again, talking about psychosocial hazards and the risk management strategies around that. This time we've taken a slightly different approach, using a more practical case scenario, something that I've tapped into my past experience. I may have been a little creative around here to add some more meaningful context to it, so you get value out of this 15 minutes of presentation. And hopefully that triggers a few questions, which we're happy to answer towards the end. Yeah, this is a scenario in a business setting which provides home improvement services and products. And in summary, what employees were experiencing, experiencing virtually, but also in person, customer aggression. Customer aggression coming from the service and products, premium products this business was selling. Now, this kind of hazard essentially would be is classified as occupational violence aggression, be it physical, non-physical in nature. What that was doing to the business was increasing emotional demands, but also increasing that aggressive interaction with customers on phones, but also through home visits when installers were providing those products and installing them. Now, through investigations and discussions with a business like this, what was uncovered, which is quite not necessarily unique, you could see these trends across different businesses in completely different settings, be it manufacturing, a business that we're talking about here, but also businesses or organizations operating in, say, the healthcare or the education sector. Now, the challenge here for the business was essentially not seeing it as either OHS or as an HR issue, because typically what happens around psychosocial hazards is you either got a complainant or an alleged respondent. Now, based on these dynamics, it's rather easy to kind of start off with an HR pathway and looking at those behavioral concerns, but also at some point you can go and tap into your OHS risk management strategies. In this situation, it kind of fell through the cracks. Again, a lot of reliance you could see in this particular case was relying on common sense and general knowledge or competence through years of experience those individuals, those employees may have had with the business or through their experience professionally with other organizations, meaning they were expected to manage these concerns tactfully. Now, again, this was pre-1st December, meaning there was a perception that there was no psychosocial risk assessment required. Hence, there were no signs of a larger psychosocial risk assessment process, but I mean, let alone OVA by itself. It was visible that OVA as a single hazard was the most critical hazard that employees were experiencing amongst many other psychosocial hazards. Again, no clear pathways in terms of what the grievance process was, or even that escalation pathway from ground level employees to mid-level management and to the leadership. Going into the operation aspect of it, that's when you look into the work factors and not just the behavioral concerns that present themselves finally. But there are clear signs. There were clear signs that there were no operational processes around, say, pre-sale documentation, but also how customer expectations were communicated. Now, this kind of pointed to a clear gap between what the sales team were promising in this case was what the operations could deliver. That clear gap was a gap which was kind of converting into friction for customers. There was enough information through non-conventional channels, meaning your social media platforms, your productivity platforms, where there were enough negative feedback about products and services, which was then kind of feeding into customer frustration. Again, these signs were not picked up by the business to kind of tap into and manage that OVA hazard. Yeah. Irrespective of this specific case scenario, you would see in the regulators' approach through improvement notices, through conversations they have with businesses. The notices, for example, when they issue, you'll see clear signs of how that entire hazard to risk controls are articulated in those documents. So you're reverse engineering that perspective or that approach goes a long way in risk assessing psychosocial hazards. One such approach that I applied in the past, and in fact even currently, is a REC, essentially, risk, exposure, and consequences. Breaking it down into logical sense in terms of what the risk is. Clearly what we've seen is the hazard is like OVA, and what does the risk look like? What are the chances of that hazard converting or eventuating into a risk? And what is that group of employees, be it individual or entire group of employees? What is that exposure? Who is exposed to that risk? Is it virtually or is it in person? In this case, customer service employees experiencing that harm through phone calls or even emails, but also installers going on site, that in-person experience they have. And again, tie that up with consequences as to what harm looks like, because you need to understand and acknowledge the level of harm. And you need to be bold enough to acknowledge that level of harm. Could be serious injuries, could be fatalities, but also, unfortunately, could be suicide. Right? So you need to acknowledge that aspect, and then tying it up with your efforts. The effort, even the act, what it talks about, and the inspectors apply, is what's that reasonable effort? How reasonable effort? What reasonable efforts have you applied to acknowledge this entire hazard risk, and then putting in those risk controls? I've spoken about the chalk approach, which is in that larger presentation piece, which I believe you may receive, but breaking it down into what reasonable effort looks like. What's the cost factor involved? What's the likelihood of that harm happening? What's the state of knowledge that you as a business or as an industry you have around those risk controls, and then applying the highest level of risk controls rather than just going for the low-hanging fruit, which could be just admin controls like training or just policies by themselves. Now, this is me risking oversimplifying this entire risk management journey, but looking at just this case, I've broken it down into something that's proactive and then that's something reactive. Reactive may be seen as negative, however, it is necessary because sometimes you see signs of this escalation. You would see it from the proactive approach, meaning the upstream aspect of a certain hazard profile, risk profile, or a task profile. In this case, clearly, there are enough proactive strategies businesses could apply, meaning, say, pre-sales expectations and documentation. That kind of communicates what the product is, what that service is. That sets the expectations with employees, sets the expectations with the customer also and the client. And aligning multiple different functions and departments in your organization, sales, operations, and your ground level operations team. That sets out or makes that process consistent and also allows you to deliver a consistent service or product to your customers. Again, having those channels through which you're getting enough feedback, be it your internal CRM processes or rather your ERP processes or your customer grievance processes, that allows you to receive that feedback before the hazard or the risk starts escalating from low to medium to high. Again, depends what you define the low, medium, and high. Having the leadership involvement proactively is something I would see as proactive aspect of the risk management approach. Now, engineering controls in the psychosocial space may not be as clear as the physical health and safety. However, all what this talks to is can you proactively communicate the risk as it escalates to your employees, but also involve your stakeholders indirectly or directly as part of the strategy, meaning your clients also could be part of it when you communicate those expectations. Now, I've highlighted a few very superficial, I believe at this point, engineering controls. Looking at your tech systems or emails or your CRM system, it allows you to see those signs, right, through that frustration, that friction, aggression developing. Also to the ground level employees, something that you would see quite common in public safety, but also the healthcare, adopting those processes in settings like these, like tourist alarms, or also providing tour-up visits, home visits. Having a call system that's a little more advanced, but also there may be a few challenges around, say, call system features where you're identifying escalating behaviors. You could have privacy and confidentiality issues when you're trying to monitor those aspects, but again, that's a knock-on risk that comes in when you are implementing, say, an engineering control like this. Again, the point is, when you put in risk controls in place, be mindful that if it's creating another risk, you need to take that into account also. Now, I've put the system level breakdown here is to essentially capture both the proactive and the responsive controls. And this is something from experience I've seen regulators critical of when they're probing psychosocial related incident, or call it allegations raised by employees. Having that proactive overview, I believe, comes through assessments, calling them risk assessments, or even calling them prevention plans, of understanding where that risk is coming from, makes you more proactive, gives you visibility of what those risk controls looks like, and also allows you to monitor and track an effectiveness of those controls. But also having your customer focus trending systems, like what we touched on earlier. Do you have enough data that we can use and track how we on a system level are tracking? I'm not saying individually profiling customers, but also seeing if there's any part of work that's contributing to such hazards and then risk eventually. So using a system level approach in mapping out your entire process and having a view of that. We can go next slide, please. Yeah. Now, again, this is the last slide, quite an important one, because you would have seen through initial communications and conversations, say on social media platforms or through newsletters, where there were conversations that you'd be expected to have prevention plans and reporting requirements in Victoria. Now, it's not mandatory. It could be confusing to a lot of businesses. The challenge with not having prevention plans and not having a reporting system, you're not required to report the regulator directly now. You're not required to report to the regulator. However, if you go and deep dive into Regulation 16 of the psychological health regulations, there is a mandatory requirement for you to review and revise risk reports. What that tells you is to go back under certain situations and cases where you're required to go and review. For example, if there's a major change in your work setting or task setting, is a requirement to go and review, for you to review proactively if that change is going to impact employees from the psychological health perspective. Or if you've got a report of an allegation of psychosocial hazards, or if there's an incident that involves an element of psychosocial hazard or that risk, you're required to go and review. So if you haven't had a benchmark or a point to start from, it is challenging for you to go and demonstrate that you've gone back and reviewed all those factors that may have contributed to the hazard or the risk that's eventuated today where you stand, where the Reg 16 kicks in. So the point being, you rather proactively assess either individual critical psychosocial hazards or all of the 16 or 17 hazards to see, so where is that risk coming from through those individual hazards. That effectively will allow you to demonstrate your due diligence and also will allow you to demonstrate the consultation that you've done in terms of arriving where you've arrived after assessing those hazards for those risks, and then you've got those risk controls in place. Unfortunately, incidents do happen. Situations do arise where the controls that you have in place may not be effective, or they may have not been implemented correctly. So that's when it becomes easier for you as an organization to demonstrate your proactiveness should you be critiqued by the regulator or not, in fact. Because eventually, a proactive approach, what it will do is allow you to foresee that risk profile developing, escalating, and would allow you to keep your employees safe, but also allow leadership to take more proactive action to kind of stop it or nip it in the bud in that sense. Again, reporting not required you're not required to report to the regulator. However, if you've got that framework set up internally, you would realize that all those 14 or 16 hazards, you would be monitoring them, and eventually through your quarterly or an annual reporting or frequency which you deem is appropriate for your business setting, would allow you to track and trend the health of the organization from the psychosocial hazard perspective, but also will allow you to connect it to the physical OHS critical risk that businesses may be exposed to. I think that's it from me. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Dhawal. We might hand over to Arthur now.
Thank you, Dhawal.
for that comprehensive case study. It was great to step through that. As mentioned earlier, my name's Arthur Papagiannis. I'm the founder and CEO of AP Psychology and Consulting Services. And thank you again for having me back to present on this topic. And really going to look at how we take an integrated approach to psychosocial risk management. I'm going to give 15 years of reflection, being in this space for some time, and just some things we've learned along the way. Moving to another case study, I think that's a really good way to see some practical application, and then really step through the Mentally Healthy Workplaces program, which many of you could be eligible for as well. So step through some of the mechanics of that. As I've just highlighted, we've been around for more than 15 years with the sole purpose to make a positive impact on the mental health and wellbeing of all people. We've chosen to do that through a workplace context. The workplace represents the community, and that extends out to the broader community as well. We aim to do that through an evidence-based lens of prevention, protection and support of psychological health and safety. You can just see here, we've got a bit of a snapshot on a real cross-section of organisations that we work with, from large enterprise, 60,000 plus, to 5,000 to 500 to 20 in this particular space. And I'll give some working examples there as well for you. So what are some of the reflections over the last 15 years? A lot's been happening in this space. If I think back when I started the business 15 years ago, it was often seen as this soft concept. Thank you, Arthur. This is all the warm and fuzzy stuff. We'll get back to business. But what we've really seen is the evolving regulatory landscape. We're now seeing psychosocial safety as a legal duty under work health safety laws, and a high level of importance in this particular space. We're also seen over the journey a harmonised risk management framework, and VIC's now officially jumped on board as of yesterday. And we're seeing that model of identify, assess, control and review, and high levels of consultation wrapped around that. States were doing that in various forms over the last 10 or so years, but we're really seeing a level of harmonisation and cohesion. What we've probably seen over the last 5 or so years is this shift towards primary controls, but I'd say probably since 2022 with Safe Work Australia, that's really honed in on that. And over the last 3 years, and in the Victorian regs as well, we're starting to see the focus on primary controls, starting to think about those work design, thinking about systems, thinking about management of work, the environment, plant, and all the impacts there. I talk about those as the primary levels of interventions, and how do we focus on a hierarchy of controls that really target that space, moving beyond just training and administrative responses. So we're starting to hone in and go, how do we target these work design areas? How do we target culture, leadership in this particular space? Which is really great to see, because we've spent a lot of time over the last 15 years talking about what's contributing to the poor mental health of our people. Now we're saying these are the things we need to be thinking about and tackling. Now we work nationally, so we've seen this big shift even over the last couple of years going into other states. Hopefully Vic and some of you have already been on this journey already, but it was that initial space of I need a risk register, kind of getting into a bit of the weeds of the detail. But now what we've seen probably over probably even the last 12 months, this maturity in tackling work design issues. Businesses are starting to get under the hood going, what is the design that we need to be thinking about? What are the systems we need to be looking at? What are those things that are impacting adversely on our people? And I'll share a case study shortly. We've got national model of code and compliance, which is great. So now there's a consistent approach to all of this. We know there's significant fines now, and we're starting to see some of those things come about. I'm not one that likes to scare people with these things, but we saw one here in Victoria, which was the Coroner's Court fined over $380,000 for failing to provide a psychologically safe and healthy work environment, highly toxic culture, incivility, high work demands, exposure to vicarious trauma, and a bunch of other things within that, which also led to a person dying by suicide. I mean, that's the extreme end of this, but we can start to see the regulator playing a big part in this space, and we'll see more of that as it plays out. What I loved over the last probably couple of years, 2 or 3 years, a shift towards industry-specific guidance and resources. So we've got the general, regs, factors, hazards. Now we're starting to see this shift into resources and guides by industry. So we helped set up a foundation, Healthy Heads in Trucks and Sheds, for the transport logistics space. So what we've got is all the research and the hazards that exist out there, and we've really geared that towards tailoring to the transport logistics industry and helping them create a mentally healthy and psychologically safe workplace. You've got Health and Education, New South Wales, that have done the same, some of the mining sectors as well. And we'll probably start to see more and more of that to support industries in honing in on what the unique hazards are of their particular industries. We're also seeing now more lead indicators, even though they're lags when we're completing surveys, but historically it's been a risk register of some sort, which is after the fact. Now we've got clearly defined factors and hazards, which become our lead indicators. They're giving us data that are telling us that's a potential risk to our people. And we've got the guides and the resources and the codes at the moment that can support us on getting ahead of this and getting in early to reduce the chances of impact on our people. And more importantly, what we're seeing is improved retention. For doing this right, organisational resilience, innovation, strong reputation by businesses, and we know that the ROI return on that is significant. Now, I know Dhawal spoke to this particular model earlier. I just want to share this in the context of a case study. If we look at the regs, we now have a consistent, as I've shared, model of psychosocial risk management, identify the hazard, assess the risk, control that risk and put strong controls in place, and then review those controls. WorkSafe Victoria has identified 16 psychosocial hazards. They're fairly consistent across the country. There's slight nuances between them all, but we're relatively all saying the same thing there. So we have something there now very clear on helping us identify the risk. Then it moves into how we assess the risk, and you can use some of the surveys to do that are out there, that are evidence-based. We've got the people at work, and a bunch of other ones. We've got our one as well that is aligned with WorkSafe practices as well. We need to consult with our people, and we need to conduct comprehensive gap analyses. Okay, that's going to help us understand what's going on, which allows us to move into the control space. And we've got WorkSafe Victoria talking about the hierarchy of controls there. Moving into design, we like to use the 7 workplace focus areas. Work design, culture, and leadership capability are the core focus areas. That's your preventative area. That's moving upstream, and they're the things that are going to make the big impact on your people. They're the things that are going to reduce burnout. They're the things that are going to reduce stress. Stress is a symptom of all of these other things. So how do we get better at this, which allows us to develop an action plan? Now I want to step through a particular case study where we applied all of this. This is where we leveraged off the Healthy Heads in Trucks and Sheds guidelines that we developed, which are fairly consistent with all of this and the hazards. So I'll move into a case study where I share with you a big piece of work we did with a large distribution centre across a number of distribution centres across the country, and we were able to deliver this somewhat like an experiment. We had 2 control groups and 2 experimental groups. The experimental groups, we're going to go through all the interventions that we're planning to roll out, all the controls. And the control group was going to engage in those supports post the program, but we wanted to learn first. So they basically continued operating as per usual. What we've got is organisational commitment, a lot of project planning, cross-functional leadership coming together, health, safety, HR, ER, executive to get that really good buy-in at that front end, and to really help us shape that second pillar on there, January to March, in looking at how do we conduct the psychosocial risk assessment, which we did across all 4 distribution centres. We conducted gap analyses across those, and we started to establish working groups to think about what controls could be put in place based on the profiles that were produced. We ran focus groups in each of those distribution centres. We conducted interviews, which looks at that consultation piece, and the top risks were identified through that process. That allowed us to move into the control space. We now had a good risk profile of the distribution centres, what their top risks were, which allowed us to design the solution. That went over, a good year process of design. So we looked at things like moments that matter. How do we reduce friction? So to give you some concrete examples of what we implemented, people were driving in for their afternoon shift and there weren't any parking spots, so they had to park 10 minutes away, which meant they were turning up potentially late for their shifts, which then had a snowball effect. Supervisors then greeting them with, "Why are you late?" So what that allowed for was opening up car spots, also staggering shift work within that. The roles within DCs is often pickers, fairly automated. All they're hearing is numbers all day. So we want to create a sense of purpose in the work that they do. And we tried a bunch of different things. Some didn't work, as Dhawal said, some things work, some things don't work, but we want to learn and review through that process. But one was really simple, and there was a bunch of other things which I'll share. Stickers. We're feeding 500 families. We're contributing to a greater purpose, which created a higher level of engagement by people. Reporting lines changed. We saw supervisors, instead of having 1 to 60, 1 to 30. So that's now adjusting resourcing there accordingly. Humanising roles, name badges, not numbers. Very important here, calling people by their name. They found shifts were finishing, and what happened at the time of shift finishing, the bus would leave the local DC, which meant they had to wait an extra hour, which meant they were getting home an hour later. Changing that by a few minutes allowed for people to get home sooner. So what we did was track from the moment people come in to the moment they go home, where can we reduce friction? Where can we create moments that matter? Leadership capability around psychosocial safety. How do we make sure our leaders know how to facilitate psychologically healthy and safe toolbox talks? A lot of investment went in with the team experience team to help them develop those skills and highlight risks. Talk about problems, things that were, we flipped the zero tolerance on its head. We wanted more reporting. Then we created a garage room where they were able to unpack any particular risks that were identified and consultatively as a group design those solutions. Rolled all of that out, and then we got to about an 18-month mark. We thought it was time to do a bit of a remeasure, and some interesting data came out of that, and I'm going to share that very shortly and move on. But we continued that beyond those particular DCs and others, and I'll share the impacts more broadly. And we're continuing to do that. So if I just go to the next slide, you can see here, just from a psychosocial risk assessment, on the left we've got the experimental group. Over the 18-month period, you can see how much they shifted across every single factor based on the interventions that we rolled out. You can see the control group either remained the same or went backwards. What did we see at the back end of that? Psychological distress reduced. The highest performing DCs were the experimental groups within that. We saw risks, so a higher level of low-level reporting in the experimental groups, less catastrophic. In the control sites, less low-level incident reporting, more catastrophic or high impact incidents through that. And that was through creating that environment for people to be able to speak up. ROI for a business, it meant the experimental group, highest performing DCs across the country compared to the control groups. And that's now being replicated. How do we replicate that across the country? So I just want to show you an end-to-end piece of work. We don't often get that opportunity to do that, but to see the significant impact of taking a targeted approach and thinking about the controls and those moments that matter and reducing the friction along the way. And it is multi-layered. Now, I've shared a lot of these already, so we can probably move on, Keith. I just want to spend a couple of moments before I wrap up, just talking about the Mentally Healthy Workplaces program. This is a free initiative for all small to medium-sized businesses where they're eligible to go through a process of psychosocial risk assessment. Now, some of the eligibility criteria connected with this, we're doing it in partnership with Victorian Chambers of Commerce and AP Psychology, supported through WorkSafe Victoria. To be eligible, you need to have less than 200 employees. You need to be based in Victoria and have a current work cover policy within Victoria. Your people need to be located in Victoria. You can have some national broader reach, but the main hub needs to be in Victoria, and have a low level of maturity in workplace psychosocial safety as well. And there's a particular screening tool that organisations complete. The organisations that aren't eligible are departments and agencies, government agencies. What do you get for this? Comprehensive psychosocial risk management solution over a 12-month period. You get a dedicated consultant from our business, which will engage you in the program. You'll get access to our Team Thrive platform, which shares clear insights into your psychosocial risk profile, controls, learning content for all your people. You'll get to go through a comprehensive psychosocial risk assessment within your workplace that's aligned to the WorkSafe psychosocial hazards that have been identified through WorkSafe. And we support you through a consultative piece in developing your action plan to target all the, implement the right controls. We support you over that 12-month period to make sure we're reviewing and making sure those controls that have been introduced are being implemented correctly or reviewed at the same time and readjusted along the way. And as a value add to all of that, there's an opportunity to access within that platform a bunch of micro-learning modules and materials and e-learns as well to upskill your leaders and broader people as well, and support you with a consultation process. A very comprehensive program for all, and we'll share the expression of interest a tad later. Might come back to this because I think we're going to talk to some of these things, Keith.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Arthur. Thank you, Dhawal. Just a reminder for the audience, we've now moved into the question time session. So I'm going to bring Dhawal and Arthur, who are our resident experts, to answer your questions. I'm going to encourage you to use the Q&A function to load up your queries. And whilst you're doing that, just a quick summary of what to expect with the regs that took effect yesterday. It is clarification of your obligations under the OHS Act. You've always had the expectation that you were protecting your workers' mental health, but the regulations now very clearly define what is expected of employers. There is definitely a focus on consultation with workers, and I think Dhawal has mentioned that through his case study example. You are expected to ensure that any time you are talking to workers about job roles, changes in their job, or anything new that is coming in, that you're demonstrating consultation with them, and that you're maintaining evidence of risk assessment. I think both Dhawal and Arthur have talked today to how you can do that practically and how you can show that. A reminder that under the new regs, when you look at the hierarchy of control, there is actually a cutoff for training. Training or administrative controls are not deemed to be acceptable by themselves. You must demonstrate that you're trying to eliminate the hazard first. You are then trying to control the risk as far as is reasonably practicable, according to Dhawal's presentation. And finally, there is no grace period. We are now, with this active regulation in place, it is performance-based. So not identifying hazards and risk assessing and implementing controls means that you're actually in breach of the regulations as they stand. So I've got some questions coming through. I think, Arthur, the first one I'd like to throw to you. There's a question from Deb. What about hazards such as low job control, where in business persons are employed for a job in which it's a job that they have little control over due to maybe QA or manufacturing requirements? How do we identify, assess, and put controls in place for those types of hazards?
Yeah, it's a really good one. We get that one quite often. There are a bunch of roles out there where they can be quite structured, quite defined, but how do we think about giving people autonomy and choice in quite a rigid work environment? It's something that's not about completely changing that work environment. And I think I was touching on the case study earlier. How do you create those little moments that can give a level of agency and control to individuals within the scope and guardrails of the work that they need to do? So a really good way of doing that, knowing that, is actually engaging with the people. We know these are the requirements of the role. This is what we need to do to get from A to B. We're saying we have little agency or control over certain things. What are the things that would be meaningful and impactful for you in your role? And that's where consultation is super strong. We're getting with our people, we're getting our people to come up with what that can look like. And sometimes we'll be surprised. People aren't looking for a lot of things. And again, these small moments of agency. I mean, I just spoke, in that case study, there was some significant money spent on some initiatives. What people wanted was meaning and purpose in some of that. And that was enough. Okay. In other things, there are more structured things that could be implemented.
And Arthur, that might even be an answer to the continuation from Deb's question. She says, also with reward and recognition, employees are paid well. So there may not be a formal reward and recognition program. So how's that a hazard? I think maybe just to highlight for Deb and our other listeners, when we talk to reward and recognition, what we've noticed in psychology is that workers, when they are producing a service or a good, actually need to know that what they're doing has meaning. It is good and meaningful work. So sometimes reward and recognition might be as simple as a manager taking some time out to acknowledge that work or a period of time where you're putting in extra work. But Arthur, do you have any other points to add to that?
And I might add to the case scenario, because that's a very good example. One was supervisors greeting their people. Let's just start with something simple, rather than why you're late. The reporting structure changes allowed for supervisors to connect with their people. So because they had high reporting structures, 1 to 60, let's say, they weren't able to get to their people, which meant they would only get to the people that either had an issue or a concern. So it was always around someone not performing. What it allowed for with the reduced structure, then giving bandwidth to supervisors, was that recognition. Appreciate your effort. Checking in with people, being able to check where people are at. And again, going to your point, a lot of it is about leaders being able to take that time. It's not often monetary. That's one component, clearly. We need that. But then it moves towards, do I feel recognised and valued for the work that I'm doing, for the effort I've put in? And they're just a couple of examples.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. Dhawal, I want to bring you in here. I've got Roland who's asked, specifically with your presentation and that case study you presented, where did you start the assessment in that case study? Did you look at it from the systems perspective first, talk to leaders or the middle management layer? Where do you start?
It's interesting because part of it, I feel, is a philosophical approach, meaning got the systems approach. However, on the ground, you start talking with someone who's raised those allegations. So you talk to the complainant. If you identify them as a complainant, get all that information. So essentially what you're doing is consulting. So even as someone who's enforcing it, or even as a consultant, you're supporting businesses, you're essentially consulting. So you're talking to individuals who see or perceive that as a risk or hazard. But of course, you go up the chain. It may not be as linear as going from down to top or top to down, but you're going back and forth between different levels of the organizations, but also eventually aiming to reach at a point where the system doesn't solely depend on an individual. However, it takes care of the individual, if that makes sense.
Okay. No, it does. And Dhawal, I might follow on with you. I've got a question here from Dasha. And you may be able to draw upon your experience when, as an inspector, you attended sites to deal with complaint. What advice do you have for employers on understanding the difference between a psychosocial risk and just general grumbling by the workforce? How do you navigate that?
Yeah. In theory, and in fact, I've seen that a very good practical support for businesses just define every hazard. As inhumane it may appear, but you want to start defining each behavior, the behaviors plus also the work factors. Once you've got a definition of what that hazard is, it allows you to scope out your action or investigation approach you have to that. So define what does harassment look like, even to going to that nitty-gritty of defining the difference between harassment and bullying, one of them being repeated in nature, because you can see the risk escalating. So defining what harassment looks like versus what occupation violence and aggression looks like. Once you've got those definitions, your leadership and in fact even your employees raising those concerns are part of the solution. So if
I think, from my time in managing workers for Dasha, my best advice is when they come to you with the grumblings, you say, okay, I'm going to listen to you, but what do you think is an appropriate solution? I think it remains grumbling where people aren't constructively being challenged to also think about how can we resolve this together? And sometimes you're able to facilitate the grumbling into something positive, or to get them to acknowledge that there may be barriers that you have to deal with first in order to enact change. Maybe I might come back to Arthur here. Arthur, Aditya has said in high-risk industries like oil and gas, relying on paper trails for fatigue monitoring or muster checks feels very reactive. Now, you've talked about digital platforms. So how critical is it to move towards a unified digital platform that visualizes the risk data in real time?
Yeah, I think what we'll see is the evolution to a more integrated approach. There's a journey we're all going on. We're trying to understand psychosocial hazards. What are the meanings, the terms, what are we looking for? And now we've got a clear understanding of what those hazards are and those factors are. And I think platforms starting to shift towards a more integrated lens, because often when we're talking about, even when we're looking at the risk management model, that applies to physical and psychological, really, and starting to have a more unified approach to that, number one, where we can, clearly, within that, and starting to bring other functional lines into place. We see organisations that have done that really well, have brought HR, safety, L&D, ER, all in together. When I shared that case study, that's what they did really well, because then you've got multiple metrics and data points coming in to help give clear direction in that space. But I think it's just, and we've seen it even with mental health maturity over the years, it's always been this kind of standalone out here, then we've kind of brought it in the fold a bit more, and we'll just see the evolution of that. But if I was to give the key messages, definitely taking that integrated approach, a unified approach, where you possibly can, within that, and starting to think about those metrics and data all being housed together.
Okay. I've got a query in from Mikey, and Mikey, I think I'm going to answer this one. Could you please provide a sample prevention plan and reporting system? So definitely for you, the new regulations that have come out, there's also a new compliance code that WorkSafe Victoria has put out with some very, very clear practical guidance and instruction, including an example of a risk assessment plan and some questions to bear in mind for your incident reporting system. The Office of the Industrial Regulator in Queensland also has an example of a risk prevention plan for bullying and harassment that is freely available now. We'll make sure that as part of the resources that come to all of the participants today, that we provide you some of these links in the Q&A answer sheet. So I've got a question here from Travis. How does it work with respect to high variable roles? That is, they are not day-to-day specific, but solving problems for clients, and as such, the requirements may be highly varied due to the problem the client is solving. So, Dhawal, if I can bring you in here, if you were to come into a business and the job role is not standard, there are new problems being presented every day based on what the clients or customers are presenting to you, how do you consider reviewing the risk there? And what would be your advice to a business on supervision or job design?
Yeah, I think taking a couple of steps backwards, even from the recruitment process, and in high-risk situations, we've gone to a point, in the past, where you've probed what your recruitment process looks like and how you're communicating, because more than often you want to attract good talent to your business and maybe intentionally or unintentionally not communicating expectations through your job ad. But that's the starting point, because the moment the employees walked in, it's difficult for them to walk backwards out of a job. It's quite challenging for them. So meaning, how are you communicating the risk and expectations? So through your your role clarity, how is workload defined? Of course, it's difficult to be prescriptive to the team, meaning every step that you take in the warehouse wouldn't be prescriptive. But If there is a change in risk profile, that's what consultation talks about. That's what the regulation talks about. So go back to the drawing board and see if there is going to be a change in the profile of the work they do, is that going to introduce more risk? Of course, a lot of things could be fluid. Meaning through those interactions, more likely they may need supervisionary support where things escalate. So they have that escalation process that I may have briefly touched on through a different setting, but apply that approach. So it's quite dynamic, and I think both for the employee and the employers, there needs to be a bridge that need to work, or rather work together. Meaning, you can't define everything. However, when you see signs of escalation, use the consultation process to kind of communicate your hazard or the risk.
Okay. Thank you for that, Dhawal.
Do you mind if I add just
please, Arthur.
Yeah, and I think just building on some of that, or just adding to, I shared those 7 workplace focus areas. When roles are quite dynamic, a really helpful way is to map against those 7s. And I think you were touching on that. Well, what do we need from leadership? How does leadership support those individuals in those roles? From a cultural standpoint, can people feel safe to speak up and say, hey, I'm feeling the pressure or the pain, or, is there clear policies, procedures, right through to then the work design pieces? What are the adjustments we can make from a system design, management, equipment, whatever that might be, to, some of that early intervention capability, uplift. Clearly, recruitment is key, getting right people in, but you can systematically move through that and introduce a number of things, because Dhawal mentioned it's quite dynamic. And you've got to pull various levers in situations like that, and they become a protective ecosystem around roles.
Arthur, I might keep you on for this next question. This is from Jess, and this is directly related to your Mentally Healthy Workplaces program. Jess says that she works with a national company. The head office is in Queensland, but the biggest branch, or one of the biggest branches, in Victoria, with less than 200 people at that site. Would they be potentially eligible?
It's total workforce employment numbers. So if they're exceeding the 200 in total, they would be deemed as ineligible for that particular program.
All right. Sorry, Jess, or hopefully, you're smiling at this moment in time. I've got a query from Maria. So Maria says that they are a labour hire firm. So, Arthur and Dhawal, we know that this is a high-risk industry to begin with. So Maria has on-hired workers working at various host employer sites in various industries and role types every day, where the duration of the roles can be 1 day or 6 months. It can be 1 worker on a site or 50 workers on a site. How do they manage the OHS obligations that are now coming through with these regs in this scenario? I might pose this first to Dhawal and then ask Arthur for your view as well. So Dhawal, from your viewpoint, especially your past experience as an inspector, what is your expectation of labour hire providers managing multi-sites and different job role requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing changes. The risk management strategy just remains same. The way I would see a labour, for all practical reasons, the way I would see a labour hire organization, separate department of the same organization. Again, how do you need to start defining at what point you've got control over what safe looks like. So if you've got control over the risk controls, that's where the responsibility lies with you. More than often as a labour hire organization, the ground level risk control sits with the principal contractor or the company that's hired your employees. But also you've got to be mindful of your rights, meaning you as a labour hire organization that is directly employing that individual, you're required to be provided with information which you can then support that individual in terms of maintaining or providing safety. Meaning you can expect, or you should expect, enough information from the person or the organization that's employing that individual, which information then you can use to, even at a superficial level, provide, say, information and instruction, or use that context if they move into a different workplace setting. So again, the point is to define what your responsibilities are. At what point you can influence the risk control, you'll need to go to that extent. And again, documentation, unfortunately, is the way you would prove due diligence.
Thank you. And Arthur, what's your advice to any business that has multi-site, multi-role requirements like that?
Yeah, echoing Dhawal's sentiments there, but we also we spend a lot of time with employers at the same time, and the onus and responsibility that they have in how they can start to think about even labour workforce as their workforce, as in the same. Sometimes we'll go in and one group gets a show bag, the other group doesn't get a show bag.
Yep.
Treating people equally through that. And we're seeing a big shift. I think that we're starting to see more and more of a shift in that space of inclusivity. I'm probably looking at it more from an employer standpoint, but what I'd echo is, those obligations, responsibilities being really clear as a labour workforce, equally the employer, but I think opportunities to connect with both to create the best impact from that.
Okay. I've got a question here from Deb. I might have a crack at answering it, but then I'll ask the two of you to add on anything if you think I missed out on it. Deb says, how do we engage and consult when we don't have HSRs and the employees are not engaged in the process, as they don't seem to have an interest in this? I think, Deb, one, your obligation as an employer is to show how you are consulting and communicating. Consulting can be as simple as providing information in a stand-up meeting or a pre-start discussion. Some businesses have just put up a whiteboard and they allow people to write down their ideas or provide feedback at any point in time, or put in a suggestion box that is anonymous to allow people to drop in content as they progress through the course of the day. So ideally, you want to encourage people to take some ownership because it's their job, it's their work environment, it's the culture that they are participating in, but you can't force them to it. But most importantly is for you to be able to demonstrate that you are proactively communicating with them. You are giving them information on job role expectations, or if there are changes that are foreseen to the way that the job or the work is being undertaken, that you give them a chance to talk to you about how they would like to have it designed or what issues they believe might be barriers to them thriving at work. But Arthur and Dhawal, anything else that you feel you want to add?
Yeah, excuse me. Exactly. So I strongly believe do not chase, let's say, not a way you're trying to achieve a perfect consultation outcome.
Yep.
Because consultation itself is a continuous process. So meaning rather have channels through which you can regularly keep getting feedback, so that motion of feedback back and forth between leadership, employees, and back is what consultation is. It could even be a passing conversation appropriately in an alleyway. If you can say that information received there was valuable enough to tweak your risk controls or provide more information about the risk profile, that's good enough. So it wouldn't necessarily reflect in terms of what documents you need, or do you need to have a 5-hour-long meeting to get information. It's a moving target. So yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious of time. There are maybe two questions here that I think are really important to answer. First one is, if we've got contractors that are part of the mix, do we have to treat them the same as if they were our employees or engaged by us? The answer is yes. The way that the regs are written, you have to consider any of the psychosocial hazards that have been created by your work and any of the risk where there's an exposure to anyone impacted by your work. Now, that could mean a contractor, but it could just as easily mean third parties like customers, etc., that are exposed to some of the risks coming out of your work. The second one is talking about how do the regs interact with psych eligibility updates under the Workers' Compensation Act? And if the regs recognise, for example, high job demands, etc., does that impact eligibility? So just to clarify, they're two separate pieces of legislation. A worker may be entitled to a Workers' Compensation claim, regardless of whether there's been a breach in the workplace or anything else that's been identified. And the same way, the new regulations are performance-based. Employers have a positive duty to identify, assess, and control risks before an incident or an injury is to occur. So if you haven't done that, if you haven't identified, assessed, and controlled, including involving your workers as part of consultation, then you may already be breaching the regulations. Now, for all of you that are on the call at the moment, we have mental health resources that are available for EML customers through the QR code that's listed there. There will also be information coming back to you after this particular webinar concludes. I do want to acknowledge that I haven't been able to ask Arthur and Dhawal all of the questions that are seen in our Q&A, and I didn't manage to get to all of those that were provided as precursors to today's webinar, but I will be taking a look at it, and together with Arthur and Dhawal, we will make sure that we respond to everything, and that comes to you in the post-webinar email wrap-up. So at this point, I might actually hand back to Nicole to close us out. Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks so much, Keith, and thanks everyone for your attendance today. A really big thank you to Dhawal and Arthur for giving us your time and expertise this morning. It was fantastic to see so many questions coming through, and yeah, looking forward to sharing more expertise with you after this. So shortly, as Keith mentioned, you'll get an email that will have a link to the recording as well as a heap of resources and answers to the Q&A. Finally, a big thank you to EML customers. Thanks for trusting us to manage your workers' compensation policy and claims. We're always here to help, so please reach out if you need any assistance. Thank you again and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.